All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 15, the chapter on Reconstruction. So, in the introduction to this chapter, we are presented with the following quote. It says, quote, "We had passably good railroads, and the next week they were all gone. South Carolina resident 1866." And what this quote is referring to is it's referring to the damage that was caused by the American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865. This was a war between the northern states, aka the free states, versus the southern states, aka the slave states. We might also use the terms Union and Confederacy. And during the course of the war, it was very long, 4 years, very bloody, the deadliest conflict in American history. And at the end of the day, it was the Union or the Northern side that won. However, once the dust settled, it became clear that there had been a lot of damage done to the country in the meantime, especially in the South. Most of the battles were fought in the South. And so, in terms of the part of the country that experienced kind of the most physical destruction, there was no doubt that it was the southern part of the country. And so, this quote or this South Carolina resident is remarking that we used to have pretty good railroads, but after the North destroyed them during the Civil War, they're essentially all gone. The conclusion of the American Civil War fundamentally established two things, or two major consequences came from it. The first was the fact that slavery was abolished, and slavery would be abolished throughout the entire United States. That was a definitive outcome and conclusion of the war. The second was that the Union was preserved. And what that means is that before the American Civil War, the Southern states attempted to secede or break away. And by the North or the Union winning the war, that meant that the Southern states would be brought back in, that the United States would be preserved as one country instead of breaking apart into two different countries. We're also presented with a photo here of contrabands taken in Virginia in 1862. So that would be during the course of the Civil War. And contrabands became kind of like a coded term for emancipated, we'll say enslaved people, especially those that escaped during the war and made it to Union lines. Union generals and Union armies enlisted the assistance of former slaves who had managed to escape during the war. And oftentimes, these quote unquote contraband would follow Union or Northern armies around and provide assistance throughout the course of the war. So, with these two kind of definitive conclusions, the Union being preserved as one country, slavery being abolished, it was now really time to kind of answer all of the additional questions. And that's really what this time period is focused on, right? So, Reconstruction is this time period after the Civil War in order to kind of answer these additional questions. So, we'll go ahead and formally define Reconstruction here. We're going to call this the time period after the Civil War. And in terms of years, 1865 to 1877. And Reconstruction kind of has two different meanings. The first is kind of the obvious, and this is the one that's going to help you remember that Reconstruction comes after the Civil War, and that is the physical rebuilding. And there would be a certain degree of physical rebuilding required. Any railroads that were destroyed in the South, like this quote revealed, would have to be physically rebuilt. But maybe the more important meaning of Reconstruction is more about rebuilding the relationship. And that is, these are two parts of the country that had a very deep and mutual hatred that caused them to kill each other for 4 years. And it was a very hard fought war. Both sides were very reluctant to surrender. So the question is, how do you go from fighting each other and hating each other and killing each other to essentially try and be like one big happy family again? Northerners and Southerners have to be Americans again. And so, really rebuilding the relationship is going to be a somewhat difficult task. We're presented here with a political cartoon that is kind of alluding to this point here. We have here, this is President Abraham Lincoln. We have sitting on a map of the United States. This is Vice President Johnson. And the quote says, Lincoln and his vice president stitching the nation back together. And so it's showing you that there's going to be an effort here by the president and vice president after the war is over to try and literally sew the country back together again. Now, as far as Reconstruction goes, there are kind of a couple of terms that might be helpful in kind of understanding what's going on during this time period. One of these terms is reconstructed. And that is during the course of Reconstruction, various states will be quote unquote reconstructed. And really, what that means is the terms by which states rejoin the Union. The states that rebelled against the United States, the Southern states, the Confederate states, they seceded or left the Union. They lost the war and they would have to re enter the United States. So when we say that a state was quote unquote reconstructed, what we essentially mean is what terms did that state need to accept in order to be brought back into the Union? Now, as far as Reconstruction goes, kind of the bare bones of it is that there are going to be three plans for Reconstruction. We're going to introduce the first plan here that comes from President Lincoln, and also three amendments to the United States Constitution. So, as long as you get the three plans and the three amendments down, you'll be in pretty good shape in terms of kind of understanding at least the political basics of what Reconstruction entails. So, Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time, and his plan for Reconstruction included kind of several conditions, right? Sort of several terms, we might say. The important ones that we're going to point out here is first, is that Lincoln required 10% of the state's population to take an oath of loyalty, we'll say. So we'll say 10% of population required to take, we'll say, oath of loyalty. And essentially, what Lincoln was saying was that, look, these are states that had broken away from the country. They were clearly no longer loyal to the United States anymore. And so, as a condition of being brought back in, Lincoln's requiring 10% of the population to take this oath. 10% of the voting population will make it a little bit technical there. Lincoln has other conditions as part of his plan. You know, he exempts or he sort of pushes out leaders of the Confederacy. So if you had an instrumental role in leading secession, in leading the rebellion, Lincoln says you're pretty much banned from the government. But this 10% ends up being, at least in the eyes of some of Lincoln's contemporaries, it doesn't seem like it's strict enough. And there's going to be kind of this question going on during the course of Reconstruction. And, you know, there's not really a definitive answer on this. But one of the questions was, to what extent does the United States take revenge on the South? And to what extent does the United States forgive the South? And this is going to be constantly kind of being weighed by both sides. Should the South have to pay for what they did in terms of their role in the Civil War? Or should they essentially be forgiven and the country kind of move on like one big happy family again? Generally speaking, requiring only 10% of the population, voting population, to take this oath of loyalty, this is a little bit more on the forgive side. Most people in the North don't think or think that maybe more needs to be done to punish the South for what they did during the war. Additionally, another part of Lincoln's plan, and this is the first of three amendments during the Reconstruction period, is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment will ensure that slavery is abolished throughout the entire United States. Lincoln said that in order for a Confederate state to rejoin the Union, they do need to ratify the 13th Amendment, which they did, and the 13th Amendment became part of our U.S. Constitution. Now, here's the thing about Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction never went into effect. Right? Lincoln's plan never went into effect. And that was because just 5 days after the American Civil War was over, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln in April of 1865. And so when Lincoln was assassinated, he was not only the first president to ever be assassinated up until that point, but it really kind of sent Reconstruction into a tailspin. Lincoln was elected in 1860, the Civil War broke out in 1861, and really his election was kind of the cause of the secession crisis. Just 5 days after the war was over, he was killed. And so, as a result of that, what it meant was now the question of Reconstruction was kind of completely up in the air. Nobody really knew what to expect following Lincoln's death. If you're not familiar with the assassination, John Wilkes Booth was a sympathizer with the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln was attending a play in Washington, D.C., when John Wilkes Booth snuck up behind him and shot him in the back of the head with a pistol. Booth would then jump onto the stage, yell something to the crowd, which most believe is death to tyrants, and a manhunt would ensue in which John Wilkes Booth would eventually be killed in a shootout. There were a handful of other people that were also convicted of being part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, and they were they were executed for being part of that. But Lincoln's sort of assassination story aside, what it meant for Reconstruction was that it was really kind of up in the air. And so when the president is assassinated, that usually, or that means that the position is then occupied by the vice president. Andrew Johnson was the vice president, now president, and he is going to provide us with the second plan for Reconstruction. So if we are keeping track, Lincoln's plan is number one, Johnson's plan is number two, as far as plans for Reconstruction goes. Now, a little bit about Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the former senator of Tennessee. He was a Southerner. And this ends up being very important as far as how Reconstruction plays out. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did Abraham Lincoln choose a Southerner to be his vice president? Well, Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson in 1864, and 1864 was a year in which the Civil War was still going on. And one of the reasons why he wanted to choose Johnson, a Southerner, was because Lincoln wanted to show some sort of reconciliation. This would at the very least be a symbolic gesture to the South that Lincoln is willing to work with Southerners in terms of trying to like rebuild the country back together again. But now this ends up being a big problem because when it comes to Andrew Johnson, he is very much going to see Reconstruction through the lens of the South as opposed to the North. Now, when the Civil War did break out, Johnson sided with the North, right? So when the Civil War broke out, Johnson sided with the North. And this is maybe an easy way of understanding Andrew Johnson was that in terms of thinking about the Civil War um, kind of logically or with his head, Johnson was very much with the North. He believed that the Civil War would be a disaster for the South. He believed that secession was illegal. And so when the war was on, he was the only senator from a Confederate state that abandoned his state and sided with his country. However, though, Johnson's heart and maybe emotions, we might say, are very much with the South. And during the course of Reconstruction, it's ultimately kind of his emotional attachment with the South that ends up kind of guiding his principles on Reconstruction. Now, Johnson adopts most of Lincoln's plan, meaning that his plan, for the most part, is mostly going to be a plan kind of forgiveness, or at least is going to be kind of less about getting revenge, less about punishment. But there is one class of people that Johnson also wants to exclude from Reconstruction, and those are the wealthy planters. So we're going to say the wealthy planters are excluded. And when we mean excluded from the US government by Johnson. And the reason why Johnson excluded the wealthy planters was, despite the fact that Johnson was from the South, he'd also grown up poor in the South, and so believing that the Civil War was a mistake, he kind of blamed the wealthy planters as being the ones responsible for leading the South into really what was a disastrous war for them. So he wants to make sure to kind of single those wealthy planters out in his plan for Reconstruction as being, look, you guys are no longer going to be able to participate in the United States government. However, though, Johnson's plan is kind of the first plan that really goes into effect. And while he was someone that certainly sided with the North during the war, as Reconstruction progresses, he becomes more and more and more sympathetic to the Southern cause. In fact, he follows a policy of quick reincorporation. That means he wants to, we'll say Johnson, wants to reconstruct, say, Confederate States as quick and painless as possible. So he's very, very, very heavy on this forgiveness question. So much so that, in fact, he begins to grant multiple pardons and amnesties to those who were previously excluded by Reconstruction. A lot of these pardons and amnesties end up going towards former Confederate leaders. So remember that even though Lincoln was pretty forgiving, he wasn't forgiving of some certain people, right? Especially the leaders. But what we find that is that during Johnson's Reconstruction, there's a lot of these former Confederate leaders that are just re-entering the government like nothing ever happened. These are the same people that were trying to break away from the United States before, that were viewed very much as traitors, and now it seems like it's all water under the bridge and everything's good. This outraged a lot of Northerners. who said that this was completely unacceptable. It's unacceptable to be forgiven so easily for the crime that is the Civil War. And they started to use a phrase. These are the Northerners in Congress. And this phrase was, "We won the war, but lost the peace." We won the war, but lost the peace. That is, the North or the Union won the American Civil War, but the way that the peace process was kind of unfolding, you would think that it was the South who had won the war. And so that was a problem, right? A big problem was what to do with all these kind of former Confederate leaders that are now re entering the government like nothing ever happened. And a lot of Northern congressmen are saying, look, no, we have to punish these people. Second big issue for Northerners was what was happening on the ground as opposed to what was happening like in Congress. And that was following the American Civil War, the states of the former Confederacy began passing a series of laws collectively known as the Black Codes. The Black Codes are a series of state laws that really create different, we'll say different and unequal law codes for white and Black Americans. And what the Black Codes are getting at is another kind of big question during the Reconstruction period. Earlier we had said that kind of one of the big questions during the Reconstruction period was, what do you do with the former Confederates? Do you take revenge on them or do you forgive them? Well, probably the second biggest question, or maybe the biggest question during Reconstruction, is really on the status of Black Americans. The legal status, the political status, the economic status. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln abolished slavery, but the Civil War never really answered any of the follow up questions. And in fact, Lincoln couldn't answer any of the follow up questions because Lincoln himself was killed. And so, for example, one of these follow up questions would be, well, slavery is abolished, but do Black Americans have equal rights to their white counterparts? Well, that would have to be answered during this period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Do Black Americans have the right to vote? Again, this wasn't explicitly clear from the Civil War, and this would be the time to kind of figure that out. And so, what the Black Codes were essentially a response to this. And in terms of these two questions, equal rights and the right to vote, the Black Codes answered both of these things with a resounding no. You can think of the Black Codes again as being, here are a set of laws for white Americans to follow, here are a set of laws for Black Americans to follow, and the laws for Black Americans are very much restrictive. So, for example, in every single former state of the Confederacy, Black men were denied the right to vote, but white men were not. There were also other laws regarding like employment, where Black Americans were required to be signed to a labor contract. White Americans, that didn't apply. There are certain property laws. Black Americans, it was illegal to own guns or alcohol or animals. White Americans can own all of those things. So really what these laws were doing, and these were being enacted under Johnson, and Johnson just let these states do that. What they essentially did was, in some sense, kind of created a sort of neo-slavery, right? Sort of a slavery by another name, that it really didn't look like much had changed, because oftentimes the punishment for being convicted of breaking one of these laws was hard labor, the same type of labor that was required under the institution of slavery. So, in addition to the problem that Congress has with former leaders joining, they're also essentially seeing on the ground that through these state laws, really not a lot is changing. And it's really going to be kind of up to Northerners to say, look, this is not why the Civil War was fought. And we're going to have to do something to make sure that really kind of the full kind of purpose of the Civil War is borne out. All right. So the question was, what were Northerners going to do about Johnson's plan? And Northern members of Congress during Reconstruction, we typically refer to them as the Radical Republicans. These are Northern members of Congress. And they really kind of answered those two earlier fundamental questions by saying, look, we want revenge and we want equal rights. And this image here is kind of alluding to that belief that radical Republicans had. This is an image here during the Reconstruction period. And what it says at the top is, all men are born free and equal. So to simply just abolish slavery and then kind of recreate an unequal society via the Black Codes was really not, in the eyes of the members of Congress, wasn't really what the Civil War was actually about. And so because Congress is fundamentally the branch that passes laws, we're going to find that most of the response by the radical Republicans is going to come in the form of passing laws. So, in response to Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which essentially does two things. One is that it provides birthright citizenship, meaning that if you are born in the United States, you are a US citizen. This would essentially cancel out or would make pretty much moot any definitions of citizenship that depended on race. And earlier Supreme Courts had actually ruled that citizenship was for white Americans only and Black Americans would be excluded. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, by saying if you're born in the US, you are a US citizen, period, essentially meant that racial requirements would no longer be part of the definition of U.S. citizenship. The second part of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is actually more important, and this is um, this notion of equal protection under the law. And this was a direct response to the Black Codes. Essentially, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 would make the Black Codes illegal, saying you can't have a set of laws for white Americans and a set of laws for Black Americans. You can only have a set of laws that apply to all Americans equally. So we can see, in some sense, that with the Civil Rights Act, Congress is fighting back. Now, a law is good, right? Definitely would like to pass a law in order to fight back against Johnson's Reconstruction, but what would be more permanent is an amendment. And the 14th Amendment pretty much is the Civil Rights Act. It's the same two things, but it puts it in amendment form. So we'll just kind of reiterate just to avoid confusion. So the 14th Amendment provides birthright citizenship and offers equal protection under the law. And if you're not familiar, an amendment changes the US Constitution. And you can think of the US Constitution as being a rule book. It is much more difficult to pass an amendment is. It requires a much higher majority of people to agree, and it's much more difficult to take away. So even though the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment are essentially the same exact thing, it's the 14th Amendment that is more permanent, right? More permanent. And this is the second of the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and later on there will be 15. Now, what is Johnson's response to these laws? Well, Johnson responds by vetoing both of them. We might say that President Johnson and to veto something is to outright reject it. So President Johnson vetoes, we'll say, the radical Republicans. And it's not just these laws, it's pretty much any law that the radicals try and pass in regards to Reconstruction. President Johnson is going to veto it. But one of the things about the way that our checks and balances work is that if a president vetoes a law, it's not the end of it. Congress can still override it. And in fact, during Reconstruction, Congress will override President Johnson's veto multiple times. We'll say President Johnson vetoes radical Republicans. We'll say radicals override the veto. So both the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment do become, well, the Civil Rights Act does become a law. The 14th Amendment, the process is a little bit different. In order for an amendment to be passed to the US Constitution, it requires 75% of the states to essentially agree. The problem is that under Johnson, these states are filled with former Confederate leaders, and there's no way that the radicals are going to be able to get the 14th Amendment passed under the current conditions of Reconstruction. And so it's in part, although they were already thinking of this earlier, but in part to ensure the ratification of the 14th Amendment is that Congress is going to provide their own plan for Reconstruction. And this is the last and final plan. These are going to be called the Reconstruction Acts. Again, if we're kind of keeping track, maybe we'll just kind of make a side note here, and that is the first plan for Reconstruction is Lincoln. Lincoln. Second plan is Johnson. Third plan is going to be Congress. And so these are our plans. And in terms of amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th as a side, right? If we're keeping track of everything. So the radicals in Congress are going to present their own plan for Reconstruction. Again, this is the third and final plan. The Reconstruction Acts are passed as a series of laws because, again, they're Congress, they're the lawmaking body, and they contain kind of several conditions. Probably the most unique feature of radical Reconstruction is the way in which it'll be enforced, and that is via the United States military. The first thing we'll say about the Reconstruction Acts is that it divides, we'll say, the Confederacy or former Confederacy into 5 military districts. And each of these districts is put under the rule, essentially a rule, of a Union general. So in some sense, there is a kind of like a remilitarization of the South. And so Congress really wants to make sure that whatever they say is going to be pretty strongly enforced, right? That's kind of what they're looking for here. The Reconstruction Acts will also require ratification of the 14th Amendment. So again, this is going to be a requirement by those states to ratify the 14th Amendment. The third thing is an abolition of the Black Codes, which essentially the 14th Amendment would do. And to get to the earlier point about voting, the radicals are also going to require that each state of the former Confederacy not only abolish slavery with the 13th Amendment, not only provide equal protection under the law for Black Americans in the South, but also require the Southern states to allow Black men to vote. Again, Black male suffrage, just sort of as a side note, 1920 is. So this is a time period in which women do not have the right to vote. And so in terms of voting, we're talking specifically about suffrage. So with these conditions, Congress is really looking to kind of put into play their own idea of what Reconstruction is about. Big problem, though, and that is President Andrew Johnson is standing in the way and doing everything he can to really try and prevent the radicals from getting what they want. And so, in some sense, when we think about Reconstruction, really kind of the big, I guess you could say, like battle for Reconstruction is really Johnson versus Congress, right? These are really kind of the two competing kind of perspectives on what ought to happen after the American Civil War is over. Now, that kind of struggle between Johnson and the Congress does ultimately come to kind of its pinnacle when Congress issues articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. And if you're not familiar, impeachment is the process to remove the president from office. This is a power that was given to the legislative branch, or this is a power that was given to Congress by the founding fathers in the United States Constitution as a way to prevent a sitting US president from perhaps abusing their power. I believe the quote is, if the president commits a high crime, Congress has the ability to remove them. And Johnson himself, although he did technically break the law, it was somewhat a very minor and inconsequential law. But as soon as Johnson did that, Congress really kind of just pounced on that as a way to really get rid of this obstacle and making kind of their plan for Reconstruction come a reality. Now, in terms of the impeachment hearings, Johnson was impeached, becoming the first US president in American history to be impeached. But impeachment has two steps. The first step is the impeachment itself, and the second step is actually the removal. So just because you're impeached, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be removed. It just means that Congress is going to have another vote on it. And when it came to the process of removal, Johnson was actually spared being kicked out of office. But really, what impeachment signaled was that the era of Johnson's Reconstruction was coming to an end and congressional Reconstruction would move forward. Johnson kind of got the idea, or he got the message, that he would no longer be an obstacle and the third and final plan for Reconstruction would finally take place. So Johnson finished out the rest of his term until 1868. And then the United States elected Ulysses S. Grant to be the next president of the US. Ulysses Grant was the former general of the Union Army. He was someone who had very little political experience, but he was a war hero. And there might not be a single person more responsible for Union victory in the Civil War than Ulysses Grant. And probably the most important thing to note about Grant and where he differs from Johnson is that he supported, or was a supporter of radical Reconstruction. And remember, radical Reconstruction is just short for congressional Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction, congressional Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Acts, these are all the same, essentially the same plan. And in terms of politics at the time, Grant was getting support from not just Northerners, but also some constituents in the South. And these individuals were, or these terms, we should say, these terms, scalawag and carpetbagger, these became kind of like slanders for Southerners, but these were some of the support that Grant and the radical Republicans got from the South. So a scalawag is a Southern Republican. And we haven't talked too much about the politics of the era, but in short, at the time, the Republican Party was the party of the North, and the Democratic Party was the party of the South. So a scalawag was a Southern Republican. This was a person that lived in the South that voted for the party of the North. They were seen primarily as traitors by their Southern, by fellow Southerners. So again, to be called a scalawag by another Southerner was sort of taken as like an insult. A carpetbagger was a Northerner who moved to the South. It gets its name from the idea that someone in the North would pack all their belongings in a carpet bag, which was a piece of luggage, and then they would move down to the South, typically to take usually a political position. And the reason, and we didn't really mention this explicitly with radical Reconstruction, but one of the things that the radicals did when they got into power was they got rid of a lot of those former Confederate leaders that had re-entered the government. And the question was, well, who's going to be in charge of all these local governments? Well, there weren't really a lot of people to choose from because the radicals had more or less punished them. And so a lot of Northerners saw that as an opportunity to move down south and be, the governor of um, the governor of South Carolina or a state senator in Alabama. So to take up political positions. And again, for Southerners, they would have looked at carpetbaggers as being like invaders, right? They had sort of Northerners who had kind of like invaded the South. But scalawags and carpetbaggers did support the Republican Party while Grant was president and while the radicals were in office. So, among the changes that were brought about by radical Reconstruction, maybe one of the more profound changes was that took place in terms of voting. And what this led to in the South was not just Black voting, but also Black men being elected to office in the South, really for the first time in American history. First in US history. Here we have an image of the African American men who were elected to the United States Senate and House of Representatives in 1862. This was political positions being obtained by African American men from kind of the local levels like sheriff and mayor, and all the way up through the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. So, what was taking place in the South as a result of radical Reconstruction was a very, very profound transformation. I mean, we can think or we can map in 1865, these people would have been considered literally property by the United States and had absolutely no rights, at least no rights legally respected. Now we fast forward to by the time that radical reconstruction kicks in, and we'll just say 1872 to make it, sort of consistent with this image. We've gone to emancipation, which is the ending of slavery, to the 14th Amendment, which is citizenship and equal protection, to voting, to holding power. And all of this took place in the span of about 7 years. That was one of the most radical transformations that you can find really in all of world history. All right, so moving on to section 3, the meaning of Black freedom. So we have a quote here. It says, quote, "It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none were too old to attempt to learn." Booker T. Washington, 1900. And this quote is referring to the ways in which lives changed for millions of African Americans who were emancipated as a result of the Civil War. And that was the ability to reclaim really kind of vital institutions that had been denied under slavery. The major kind of ones worth mentioning here are institutions like marriage, education, and really the ability to build communities and interact with one another. This mostly happened around churches. So we could say that these were all institutions that were denied under slavery, that were reclaimed after the Civil War. Under slavery, marriages between enslaved individuals were not recognized. Enslaved individuals were denied education. In fact, literacy was illegal for enslaved people to be able to read and write. In fact, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. And there were many, many, many laws restricting the ability for enslaved individuals to even meet or congregate together, to even build up communities. So, all of the vital things that had been denied under slavery with the 13th Amendment and in the post Civil War era, these would become very important institutions and really kind of the building blocks of African American communities in the United States. Now, there was one other kind of very important demand that many of those who had been enslaved had, and that was the demand for land. Because the South was very, very rural, the idea of people who had been enslaved before of simply just like working in the factories or working for the railroads or kind of doing the same sort of economic things that Northerners did, that just wasn't a reality in the South. What the South had was a lot of farmland. And the idea was that land could lead to a certain amount of self sufficiency, a certain amount of independence, a certain protection. However, though, as we find throughout the period of Reconstruction, one of the kind of the great failures of Reconstruction is that there ends up being no kind of comprehensive land policy. It's not to say that it wasn't mentioned. In fact, we have an example here. Special Field Order number 15. This was an order by the Union or the Northern General Sherman to redistribute land. And even though it did happen on a small scale, General Sherman did not have the authority to enact any type of widespread land policy. And so, even though there was a proposal and some kind of small scale land redistribution, General Sherman did not, we'll say, did not have national authority, right? In fact, it was from Special Field Order number 15 that kind of, I guess you could call it a rumor or a meme or an idea. This was the notion of 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman said that every former slave would get 40 acres and a mule. But again, that was not a comprehensive land policy. Other institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau did also maybe kind of propose some sort of land policy. The Freedmen's Bureau was an organization or bureau, I guess, we'll just say set up by Congress to help. And it should be worth mentioning that freedmen, this was the term that they used in those days to describe those who had been recently emancipated. It referred to men and women, but they just used the term freedmen's. So this was set up by Congress to help the newly emancipated. And some of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was they provided things like food, shelter, education, schooling, job training, right? So the idea here was that Congress was going to set up this institution to kind of help people bridge the gap to life being newly emancipated. However, the Freedmen's Bureau did not ultimately come to any sort of policy that would allow for widespread land acquisition by those who had been enslaved previously. So those were some significant, well, in this area, marriage, education, and churches, those were some significant changes, but there were also many things that were lacking from Reconstruction. And in total, not just because of land, but for other reasons why we'll talk about here shortly, most historians would consider Reconstruction overall to be a failure. And one big failure is the lack of kind of any type of land policy that did not take place. Now, in addition to changes brought about by the 13th and 14th Amendments, there's one last amendment that we have yet to cover, and that is the 15th Amendment. And much like the 14th, this just kind of solidified what the Congress had already done by law. The 15th Amendment is black, or actually, I mean, that's the practical outcome, is universal male suffrage. And if you're not familiar with the term suffrage, suffrage refers to the right to vote. And so this was an amendment that allowed for all men, regardless of race, to be allowed to vote. And so, kind of putting into the Constitution what Congress had already done through radical Reconstruction. Now, the 15th Amendment ended up creating some controversy, especially as it pertained to the political rights of women, because as we said earlier, the 15th Amendment explicitly enfranchised Black men while continuing to deny women the right to vote. And that's to make the point that at the time, there were already organizations and people speaking on behalf of women's suffrage, on behalf of women's rights. Organizations like the American Equal Rights Association or the AERA, these were some of the organizations that championed for women's rights and most specifically the right to vote. And so people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, here's Stanton right here, here's Anthony right here. When the 15th Amendment was passed, it kind of brought up some questions, and that was, ought people like Stanton to support it, or are they to oppose it? Because, well, we'll talk about that here in a second. And so one of the great impacts that the 15th Amendment had was that it split the women's rights movement. over those who either would support the 15th Amendment or oppose it. So, on the side of those who supported it, we've got Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is the longtime abolitionist. He was also a supporter of women's rights. And let's see, organizations like the American, in fact, the AERA split up as a result. And so organizations formed on whether or not you support the 15th or you are opposed to the 15th. The American Women's Suffrage Association. And on the opposition side, we have Elizabeth Stanton, who was a well-known women's rights advocate. We have Susan B. Anthony, who opposed it. And organizations like the National Woman Suffrage Association. So this question of support or oppose the 15th Amendment more or less came down to how do you view it? If you are on the side of support, the idea would be that Black men getting the right to vote before women or before white women was kind of like progress, right? You sort of take one step at a time. Black men today, white women tomorrow, or just all women tomorrow. Those that opposed it saw it very explicitly as an amendment that denied women the right to vote. And in some sense, you couldn't support it, right, for that reason. And so people like Stanton and Anthony. And so the 15th Amendment remained kind of a very kind of divisive issue as far as women's rights goes. And like we mentioned earlier, it would be all the way until 1920 until women's suffrage was achieved. One last thing that we'll mention in terms of women's rights and the impact of Reconstruction, we just have a couple of images here. Here's an image celebrating the 15th Amendment, a parade that was held in Baltimore in 1870, celebrating the right to vote for Black men and the right to hold office. We also have a petition for universal suffrage in 1865. So as they were discussing the 15th Amendment in Congress, there were definitely voices out there that were saying, look, now is the time for women's suffrage. Congress decided to pass up on that, and the 15th Amendment did not contain women's suffrage in it. But what came with Reconstruction, and this is kind of important because it ends up being very important for just American history, sort of as it continues, and that is the impact of the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment has become, in some ways, maybe the most important amendment to our Constitution. And you might be thinking there's no chance because the First Amendment has got to be the most important, the Amendment on freedom of speech. But in fact, I think you probably could make an argument that the 14th might be the most important. This idea of equal protection under the law has been invoked so many times since the 14th Amendment. Now, initially, this amendment was designed to get rid of black codes. It was very specifically designed for the discrimination against African Americans in the South. But it also applies to every single other case of discrimination you can think of. And almost immediately, advocates for women's rights began invoking the 14th Amendment in their really struggle to achieve equal rights. And this strategy, or this term known as New Departure, this was pretty much to use the 14th Amendment in order to vote. Because if you think about it, if the 14th Amendment says that the law applies to everyone equally, well, then the law regarding voting should also apply to men and women equally. And so people like Susan B. Anthony, especially, they began just going out and voting. And when they got arrested, they would say, look, we have this thing now called the 14th Amendment where the law applies to everyone equally. Therefore, I should be able to, I should have the right to vote. So it's kind of an interesting way in which this amendment that is very much created in the context of Reconstruction, the relationship between, African Americans and whites, it becomes much more broad and expansive almost immediately. And ever since Reconstruction, any case of discrimination, whether it's gender or race or immigration status or sexual orientation or whatever it is, any of those cases are usually going to be invoking the 14th Amendment. Moving on to Section 4, racial violence in Reconstruction. So resistance to Reconstruction didn't go away. Before, under President Johnson and Johnson's plan, resistance was much more out in the open. It was more formal. It was former Confederate leaders being elected to mayor and governor and senator and even the president, Andrew Johnson, who was very sympathetic. But after Johnson's impeachment, and when the radicals kicked many of the former Confederate leaders out, much of the resistance to Reconstruction became more informal, underground, invisible, and much more violent. In fact, Reconstruction is one of the most violent periods in American history in terms of domestic issues. Race riots broke out in cities across the United States, namely in the South. Upon emancipation, a lot of free individuals made their way into the cities. The cities became kind of a catalyst then for racial violence or riots. Cities like Memphis, for example, New Orleans experienced race riots following Reconstruction. And probably one of the most infamous examples of racial violence in Reconstruction was what happened in Colfax. And much of this violence, we should be clear, is aimed at the political advancements of African Americans, are these new rights that African Americans have that make them the target of this type of violence. The Colfax massacre was an incident in which over 100 were killed, most of them African American, and this was in response to a Republican judge being appointed. So it was political in nature. Violence was not only restricted to kind of rioting, but could also act on an interpersonal level. There were lots of incidents where white violence against black, white violence against black victims went unpunished. And this could have been from like a property dispute or some sort of interpersonal dispute. But this was also the violence that kind of characterized this era. And then there was the much more kind of organized violence. Aside from rioting, aside from interpersonal violence, specific organizations that were designed to revert back the gains that African Americans had made. And probably the most infamous of these organizations was the Ku Klux Klan, which you can see a image here showing a member of a Klan shooting a gun, presumably killing a member of a black family in this photo. The Klan was initially, so we might just say about organized vigilantes, the types of organizations targeting, we'll say black political gains. The Klan became the most infamous, we'll say most infamous organization used terror and violence to try and, say, reinstate Confederate order. So by no means was the Klan the only organization, but definitely the one that became the most well known. And they were much more organized in terms of using violence and terror, targeting black elected officials. A very kind of common tactic was to go out to polling places, right, where people vote, bring guns and simply just intimidate people from coming out and voting, or maybe even going to political gatherings and using violence to sort of break that up. So what the North found was now they had resistance sort of in a different form, and this form was underground. The Ku Klux Klan sometimes is called the Invisible. Oops. Invisible Empire in the South. I mean, simply the fact that they actually wore hoods to conceal their identities kind of alludes to this a little bit. And so Northerners knew that they had to act. And, with President Grant in the White House, Grant was a military guy. He was willing to use force in order to combat anyone trying to use violence to kind of revert or roll back changes. Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, and this made it illegal to deny African Americans their rights, specifically targeting groups like the KKK. So federal troops were present in the South. Recall that the radicals had enforced Reconstruction through military force. And so each time an incident of violence would break out, federal forces were typically sent in and fire was met with fire. The first iteration of the Klan, because it has met with such a strong response, is more or less put out of business. And it's kind of different versions of this organization that emerge again, sort of in future moments in American history. So the uptick of violence was met similarly by a violent response by the federal government. And this is one of the reasons why we talk about this period as being one of the most violent periods in US history. But what it meant was that as each month and each year went on, there were sort of incidents of violence every couple weeks, every couple of months or so. And Northern audiences begin to grow a little bit tiresome of kind of the continual violence, the continual policing, and kind of the continued US presence in the South. But it certainly is a feature as Reconstruction goes on. Because of the uptick in violence, politically, both sides kind of accused each other of quote unquote waving the bloody shirt. And to wave the bloody shirt is to use violence. And some of this could be used from the Civil War to try and make a political point. And, this could be used by both the Republicans and the Democrats, although I think the Republicans were accused of it more often. But what it essentially meant was that Republicans in office would bring up the fact that the South had seceded, that the South was responsible for the Civil War, that they had caused so much bloodshed. And so, kind of, therefore, they should allow Northerners or Republicans to kind of get their way. And so, this kind of term, waving the bloody shirt, kind of showed how politicians used violence in order to try and like justify whatever argument or whatever law they were trying to pass. All right, so moving on to section 6, economic development during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War and Reconstruction meant a pretty big change as far as the Southern economy went. This was an economy that, in kind of the old South, as they might say, it was based off of slavery and cotton. And with the American Civil War, at least one of the major legs of the Southern economy was now done for. So the question was, as far as the Southern economy goes, now what was the question? In fact, during the Civil War, the Southern economy really didn't serve the South all that well. Being an economy only on slavery and cotton, they really lacked the materials to fight the North. And that was one of the big reasons why the South actually lost the Civil War. They didn't have a kind of a modern economy. A lot of people hoped that the New South, and they even used this term, the New South, would be industrial, that the South would build railroads and factories and kind of develop in the same way that the North did. Unfortunately, though, the New South also was not a reality. Yes, there was some industrial development in the South after the American Civil War, but for the most part, the South remained really kind of just a rural economy and really ends up kind of lagging behind um, in poverty really into the 1930s. But let's talk about some of the changes as in terms of labor. So the fact that the New South did not develop kind of very sophisticated economy like the North did, it really meant that a lot of people who had been enslaved before could not obtain the same professions as their counterparts in the North. In fact, many people in the Freedmen's Bureau had hoped that former slaves could simply just work in factories or work for the railroads, like a lot of Northerners did. But because the South remained rural and because there was no land policy, the predominant profession that those who had formerly been enslaved, um, but not exclusively, became sharecropping. And sharecropping, we'll say, is the profession most former enslaved people have. And what sharecropping involves is working on someone else's land. You're required to work on someone else's land. And in order to do that, it really kind of incurs a cost or incurs debt. So work on someone else's land, which requires debt. And what sharecropping became for really millions of people, probably, is a sort of debt cycle. Essentially, you can think of it this way: you have a person who is recently emancipated, doesn't have any property to their name, but they do have the skills that are required to grow whatever is necessary. You have a landowner who no longer has or can no longer enslave anyone to do that labor. So, what you have is sort of this kind of meeting of the two: landowners with no labor, laborers with no jobs. And in order for the laborer to work on the land, it usually requires that they themselves have to pay money. So they have to buy the seeds, rent the land, rent the tools. After they do that, they grow the crop. After the crop is done growing, they share part of it with the landowner. That's where the term sharecropping comes from. But the point of the system is that the sharecropper can never get out of debt. No matter how much they grow, they still owe money for using that land. So millions of people found themselves kind of trapped in a maybe sort of debt slavery. So there was a lot of similarities, or you could draw similarities between sharecropping and slavery, although we had gone through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There were other ways in which kind of the newer South still resembled the Old South. For example, many states passed vagrancy laws. These were essentially laws against unemployment and homelessness, essentially, is what a vagrancy law means. And if you were arrested by one of these vagrancy laws, the prisons could then take their convicts and lease them out through businesses. And this was known as the convict lease system. So this allowed prisons to lease, which means kind of to rent, prisons to lease convicts to businesses. And of course, as a convict, you wouldn't get paid for your work. The prison would get paid for your work. So the combination of vagrancy laws plus prisons renting out prisoners to do work for businesses, this was, again, certainly we could say unfree labor. And it was some of the ways in which labor was similar to what it was in the past. So when we think about the major transformation of the Southern economy, I mean, it's not really that big of a transformation economically. It remains rural. Cotton maybe is less depended on, but certainly a rural economy. And then labor systems like sharecropping, vagrancy laws, and convict lease systems all continue to perpetuate at least some form of not completely free labor, at least not in the same way that the northern economy is built. And we see a couple images here too. I think the textbook does a good job of showing you just exactly what the damage was like to the Southern economy. And like I mentioned earlier, it really took until about the 1930s for the Southern economy to, to really kind of recover in some ways. Now, over to the Northern economy, we have a completely different story. The Northern economy was industrial. It was urban, which means city. It was based off of factories, railroads. And during the course of the Civil War, I mean, you could kind of say that the Northern economy thrived. You know, they had the factories to produce the weapons, they had the railroads to move the troops, they had the banks to finance the war. And in a lot of ways, economic growth continues in the North after the Civil War. We'll say economy continues to grow and in some ways really sort of thrive. And there's a couple of reasons for why this is. First is because of the currency. During the American Civil War, the United States government issued the greenback. This was a federal currency. So it helped to stimulate the economy. And the greenback more or less is the basis for our federal currency today. I mean, our dollars are green. So this was kind of one way of doing it. Congress also passed the Morrill Land Grant, which established colleges. And you could think a bit about this as being sort of like an investment in the country. It also passed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act essentially gave away cheap or free land to people willing to move west. We'll get to the West in a future chapter here, but a lot of the economic development that did happen in the country was not just in the North, but also in the West. And so the Homestead Act essentially said, look, here's free land. All you have to do is move out, develop the land in some way. So you have to improve it in some way. And a lot of people took advantage of that. As we'll learn in a later chapter, the promise of free land in the West did not always kind of live up to expectations. But what we could say definitively about all three of these things, the issuing of the greenback, the Morrill Land Grant, the Homestead Act, I mean, these were all in some sense ways that the government stimulated the economy. And kind of the last point that we'll make here is really kind of the path to which the United States is headed, and that is constructing the first transcontinental railroad in American history. A transcontinental railroad is a railroad that crosses the entire country. And this was completed in 1869, just 4 years after the American Civil War was over. And this was considered sort of a major economic engineering achievement. And it really was a sign that the North would continue to thrive economically. All right, so we got the last section here, and that is the end of Reconstruction. And right at the very beginning of this section, the textbook actually quite nicely kind of encapsulates why Reconstruction came to an end essentially in one sentence. And it says, Reconstruction ended when Northerners abandoned the cause of those formerly enslaved. That is to say that Reconstruction was like a slow, gradual retreat. And Northerners, just kind of as the years dragged on, really kind of became tired of the commitment and were no longer willing to commit to Reconstruction like they did in the past. Another reason why Reconstruction ended had to do with the broader Republican Party. Remember that the Republicans were the party that supported Reconstruction. And when they became less popular, it meant that their policies regarding Reconstruction also suffered. There are several reasons why the Republicans declined. We'll mention one of them here, and that was the economic depression of 1873. And that is when the economy we'll say when the economy suffered the ruling party, which was the Republican Party, Republicans, also suffered. So you can imagine a lot of people voting against the Republicans because they were blamed for the terrible economic conditions. And because the Republicans became less popular for economic reasons, that meant that the other party, the Democrats, would now become more popular. And this would also translate onto the policies of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction suffered as a result of the Republican decline, and the decline was not always related to the issue of Reconstruction itself. You had people in the South that were talking about self rule or home rule. These were individuals that wanted to restore the South kind of back to its old former glory. These people were called redeemers, and redeemers wanted to restore the South to what it was before. Well, maybe we'll not exactly that. Who wanted to restore the South to its former glory. We'll just say that. Very much wanting to throw out the Republicans. They were anti Scalawag. They were anti carpetbagger. And quite frankly, anti black. They were not in favor of African Americans who had assumed positions of political power. And as kind of each year went by, as the economy got worse and worse, as the violence over Reconstruction continued to drag on and on and on and on, the Redeemers began growing more so in number and in influence, and they began to win back a lot of these kind of local government positions. These were people who maybe were not directly involved in the Civil War itself. so they wouldn't have been punished for having a role in the Civil War, but they were certainly looking to restore the South kind of to its previous glory, for lack of a better term. And kind of a very important incident happened in Mississippi, and we sometimes call this the Mississippi Plan. And this, in some ways, ended up being a turning point for this. Now, we know at the time President Grant was willing to send in federal troops whenever violence occurred, but in 1875, violence broke out in Mississippi. This was the type of violence to intimidate voters. And the North, or we might say the federal government, did not send in troops. Essentially, the governor of Mississippi sent a plea to President Grant, said, look, we have violence again. Our votes aren't free and they're not fair. Please send in the troops. And Grant, who had always sent in the troops before, time and time and time again, by this point in 1875, he's starting to hear from members of his own party that are saying, look, the general public is really just kind of tired of the constant policing of the South. They're tired of this violence. They're tired of Reconstruction. And members of Grant's own party said, look, if you send in the troops again, we're not going to support you. And so Grant was left with a difficult decision. He ultimately decided that he would not send in the troops. And that had a sort of cascading effect throughout the South, that violence was effective. That if violence is used at the polling place, there will be no federal intervention. And this culminated the very next year with a presidential election, the election of 1876. This was a presidential election. And by this point, the Redeemers had made up some pretty decent progress. It pit the Republican Rutherford Hayes, so he is Republican. And remember, Republicans are the party of the North, against Samuel Tilden, who was the Democrat, who I believe actually wasn't from the South, but he sort of represented the South. And the result of this was essentially a tie, result of this election. And so there's a very kind of tense atmosphere because the way in which this election was so close, it was thought that perhaps some sort of violence might break out. And so what Hayes and Tilden did was established a compromise in regards to this election. So the Compromise of 1877 was set up first initially as a way to settle the 1876 election. And again, when we mean tie, I don't mean like a literal tie, but there were a number of states in which the vote total was so close that those states could have gone either way. I think there were 4 states in which the election was so close between the two that both sides could potentially say that they won. And so instead of having some sort of violence break out or some sort of chaos ensued, Hayes and Tilden kind of looked to each other and said, look, let's meet behind closed doors and let's figure something out so that we don't devolve into something like another civil war. And so when they met, they reached the Compromise of 1877, and this was a way to settle the election. But at the end of the day, what the Compromise becomes the most well known for is sort of the conditions that Tilden, the Democrat, ends up getting. So what is the deal? Well, the deal is Hayes will become the next president. And Hayes is from the North. He is the Republican. And so the Northerners are kind of getting this. So the question is, what does Samuel Tilden and his Southern followers get in return? And the answer is an end to Reconstruction. And what we mean by that literally is the removal of federal troops from the South. So remember that for the radicals in Congress during Reconstruction, um, the way in which it was enforced was through the use of troops. And so all during Reconstruction from, 1870, 71, 72, 73, for years, troops remained in the South to make sure that 13, 14, and 15 were being abided by. Now, because of the Compromise of 1877, because troops are being removed, effectively this means that nobody is going to be there in the South to enforce those laws. So it's this reason that we consider the Compromise of 1877 to be the ending of Reconstruction.